People said Singapore could never fall. It was the fortress that guarded the East, the pride of the British Empire, the shining symbol of imperial power. Yet, beneath the surface of confidence, something darker was brewing. As the world drifted into the chaos of World War II, a quiet fear spread through the region, whispers of a rising Japan, whispers that the unshakable fortress might one day be tested. No one believed the whispers. They should have. For over a century, Singapore had stood as the British Empire's strongest outpost in Asia. The island sat at the crossroads of major sea routes between India and China, between Australia and Europe, making it one of the most strategically important locations in the world. British officials liked to compare it to Gibraltar, calling it the Gibraltar of the East, a nickname that echoed confidence and power. Massive naval docks, underground fuel tanks, airfields, and coastal artillery batteries surrounded the island. Anyone who saw it believed the myth: Singapore was invincible. Britain had poured millions of pounds into building a naval base at Sembawang, imagining that if trouble ever came, a powerful British fleet would sail from Europe to defend the island. But in reality, by the late 1930s, Britain was already stretched thin. War in Europe against Nazi Germany consumed ships, planes, and money. Singapore remained a jewel, but one protected more by reputation than actual readiness. Still, the myth lived on. British newspapers proudly claimed that even if every country around Singapore collapsed, the island would stand firm for at least 6 months against any attack. The commanders in Singapore believed this so strongly that they barely considered the possibility of a land invasion. All their defenses, the giant 15-inch coastal guns and the concrete bunkers, were aimed at the sea, facing south. After all, no enemy would be foolish enough to attack through the dense jungles of Malaya from the north. Or so they thought. Far away in Tokyo, a different belief was taking shape, one built on ambition, desperation, and hunger for resources. During the 1930s, Japan transformed into an aggressive military power. Its invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and its extended war with China in 1937 showed just how far Japan was willing to go. When the United States and Britain placed economic sanctions on Japan, cutting off oil, metal, and rubber, the Japanese military leadership felt cornered. Without resources, their empire would collapse. The only solution, they believed, was to seize the rich territories of Southeast Asia. But those riches, Malaya's rubber and tin, Indonesia's oil, Burma's rice, were protected by one major obstacle: Singapore. To conquer Southeast Asia, Japan first needed to break the fortress that the British claimed could never fall. And so, a bold plan began to take shape, one that flipped British assumptions upside down. While British officers practiced parades and believed jungle warfare was nearly impossible, Japanese soldiers trained specifically for it. They learned to move silently through forests, to repair bridges quickly, to use bicycles for speed, and to strike before defenders could react. They studied the layout of Malaya, the weaknesses in British defenses, and the overconfidence of their commanders. Japan understood something that the British refused to accept. A fortress is only as strong as the imagination of the people who defend it. By late 1941, warnings began pouring into the British headquarters in Singapore. American intelligence officers suspected a Japanese invasion was coming. Australian commanders requested reinforcements. British spies in Indochina reported Japanese troops gathering near the Malay border. But General Arthur Percival, confident, cautious, and somewhat indecisive, did not react strongly. He believed the main threat was still a naval attack. The idea of thousands of Japanese soldiers marching down Malaya, through swamps and thick jungles, seemed absurd to him. Civilian life in Singapore continued as usual. Busy markets, cinemas, trams, rickshaws, and European clubs filled the city. But underneath the routine, anxiety grew. Rumors spread, Japan is preparing for war. They will attack soon. We are not ready. And yet, official broadcasts kept repeating the same line: Singapore is safe. Singapore cannot fall. Then came 7 December 1941, a date that would ignite the entire Pacific into flames. On that morning, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, dragging the United States into the war. But on the same day, almost simultaneously, Japanese forces invaded northern Malaya. The long-awaited storm had begun, and it was heading directly towards Singapore. The British commanders were stunned by the speed and skill of the Japanese advance. Within days, Japanese aircraft destroyed the British battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, ships that were supposed to deter any invasion. Their sinking sent shockwaves across Asia. Without naval protection, the myth of the fortress began to crumble. As the Japanese army swept down through Malaya, towns fell one after another. The British, Indian, and Australian soldiers fought bravely, but they were outmaneuvered at nearly every step. Japanese troops used bicycles to race through jungle roads, moving faster than the British believed possible. They launched attacks at night, infiltrated camps, and cut off supply routes. British defensive lines collapsed again and again. By early February 1942, the Japanese reached Johor, the southern tip of Malaya, just across the narrow strait from Singapore. From the hills, they could see the city's tall buildings, its harbor, its airfields. Singapore, once a symbol of unshakable British power, now looked vulnerable and exposed. Inside the city, panic grew. Roads filled with fleeing civilians. Food shortages began. Air raid sirens screamed through the night as Japanese planes bombed key areas. The once confident British officers now faced an undeniable truth: the enemy they underestimated was now at their doorstep. And so, the stage was set. The fortress that could never fall was about to face the greatest challenge in its history. The myth was breaking, the storm was here, and the Battle of Singapore was about to begin. The first week of the Japanese invasion stunned the British command. What they had dismissed as impossible was now unfolding with precision and speed that none of their planners had anticipated. The Malayan Peninsula, stretching hundreds of kilometers north of Singapore, became the battleground where the fate of the Gibraltar of the East would be sealed, not by the clash of massive ships or artillery, but by swift, relentless assaults along narrow roads, swampy jungles, and rivers that British intelligence had considered natural defenses. Those defenses were shattered one by one. The Japanese advance began at Kota Baru, on the northeastern coast of Malaya. Even as British officers struggled to understand the scale of the attack, Japanese landing craft rushed through the waves in the darkness before dawn. Within hours, they secured a foothold, setting in motion a chain of events that would roll down the entire peninsula. What shocked the defenders most was the fierce coordination between the Japanese infantry, their air force, and their engineers. Every time British or Indian units prepared a defensive position, Japanese bombers appeared to soften it, or tanks slipped through a patch of terrain the defenders considered impassable. British strategy depended heavily on the idea that tanks could not move through Malayan jungles. Yet Japanese engineers proved otherwise. They widened narrow paths, set up temporary bridges overnight, and used lightweight tanks that maneuvered across muddy roads. What followed was not a traditional battlefront, it was a rapid, mobile war that the British were never trained for. Just days into the campaign, the Japanese introduced tactics that became the hallmark of their push: bicycle-mounted infantry. These were not ordinary bicycles, the tires were reinforced for rough surfaces, and soldiers carried rifles slung across their backs. This simple innovation gave them a speed advantage that completely outmatched British expectations. Bridges destroyed by retreating defenders were quickly repaired, felled trees meant to block roads were dragged aside, and jungle paths, invisible to untrained eyes, turned into secret highways for Japanese movement. Meanwhile, the British units made up of British regulars, Indian divisions, and Australian brigades were handicapped by poor communication. Many fought valiantly, but they were spread thin and lacked air cover. Japanese aircraft ruled the skies. With most British planes destroyed early in the campaign, the troops on the ground were constantly exposed, unable to hide their movements or protect their supply lines. Every day, the Japanese pressed closer to the heart of British Malaya. Towns like Alor Setar, Jitra, Gurun, and Ipoh fell in rapid succession. The defenders attempted to mount counterattacks, but coordination problems, limited reinforcements, and unfamiliarity with jungle warfare ruined their efforts. In many battles, units fought bravely only to discover that Japanese forces had quietly maneuvered behind them, threatening to encircle entire brigades. Retreat became the only option. As the days passed, the psychological pressure on the defenders deepened. They could not see the enemy approaching, only the sudden flashes of gunfire or the roar of aircraft overhead. Many soldiers later described the Japanese as if they appeared out of the jungle itself, moving with a confidence that suggested perfect knowledge of the terrain. In reality, Japanese commanders relied on local guides, captured maps, and years of preparation that British leaders had underestimated. One of the most devastating moments came when the Japanese captured Penang, a key island on the western coast. Instead of fighting a desperate defense, British officers evacuated quickly, leaving behind civilians who had trusted British protection. This event shook morale across the region. If Penang could be abandoned so swiftly, what would stop the British from abandoning Malaya altogether? Through December 1941 and January 1942, the Japanese advance rarely slowed. Each retreat pushed the British closer to their supposed safe haven, Singapore. The causeway linking Johor to Singapore became the final lifeline between the collapsing mainland defences and the island fortress. As Allied troops withdrew southward, they carried stories of surprise attacks, encirclements, and overwhelming Japanese momentum. These stories spread through Singapore's civilian population, unsettling a city already fearful from air raids. The Japanese approach to warfare also unsettled the defenders through its unpredictability. At Gemmas, Australian troops launched a well-planned ambush that inflicted heavy losses on Japanese forces. For a moment, hope flared that the advance could be stalled. But the Japanese regrouped swiftly, changing their tactics, bypassing strong points, and exploiting gaps in the defensive line. Victories that took hours were undone in days. The fall of Kuala Lumpur in early January delivered another blow. The capital of British Malaya, with its infrastructure, supply stores, and symbolic significance, fell without a major fight. British officers realized what they had refused to admit earlier: the Japanese were not simply advancing fast, they were dismantling the entire defensive structure of Malaya. Roads, airfields, and supply depots that the British thought would support a long war were now in Japanese hands. By the third week of January, the retreat became desperate. The long trek to Singapore was choked with tired soldiers, wounded men, and vehicles carrying whatever supplies remained. Japanese aircraft strafed the roads, slowing the withdrawal further. Food shortages began, and some units went days with almost no communication from higher command. Still, the soldiers kept fighting, moving south with one thought: reach Singapore. Behind them, the Japanese were preparing their final push. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, leading the campaign, understood that victory in Malaya would mean nothing unless Singapore fell. From the hills of Johor, Japanese artillery units began assembling positions overlooking the island. They knew the final confrontation was near. On the night of January 31, 1942, the last Allied soldiers crossed the causeway into Singapore. Explosive charges were set. At dawn, British engineers detonated them, blowing a massive gap and severing the physical link between Malaya and the island. Smoke rose into the sky as thousands watched the only land connection crumble. It was a symbolic moment, the final admission that Malaya had been lost. But cutting the causeway did not stop the Japanese. They brought rafts, repair teams, and engineers trained for rapid river crossings. They studied the island's northern shoreline and prepared for an amphibious assault. From across the strait, Japanese artillery pounded British positions, testing the defenses and weakening morale. Inside Singapore, the reality could no longer be ignored. The enemy had reached the gates of the fortress. Civilians crowded markets to gather supplies. Families dug trenches in their backyards. Schools shut down, and thousands sought shelter in public buildings. British officers attempted to reorganize their shattered units, merging survivors from different regiments, redistributing rifles, and digging new defensive lines. But deep inside, they knew they were working against time. The myth of the fortress had been broken before the battle for Singapore even began. The island of Singapore, once a jewel of the British Empire, now braced itself for the storm. January 1942 had ended with a sense of unease that had escalated into panic. From Johor across the narrow strait, Japanese troops were preparing for the assault, while British forces scrambled to fortify the island's northern coast. Every officer knew that this confrontation would decide the fate of the entire region. Yet, even amidst frantic preparations, there was a lingering belief that the city could hold, a belief rooted in pride and denial rather than reality. General Arthur Percival, commander of the British garrison, faced an impossible challenge. His forces consisted of around 85,000 men, a mix of British, Indian, and Australian soldiers. They were poorly equipped for jungle and island warfare, with outdated artillery, limited ammunition, and insufficient air support. Morale was shaky. Troops were exhausted from the rapid retreat down Malaya, witnessing friends and colleagues die or vanish in skirmishes along the way. But Percival had little choice. He needed to organize defenses along a coastline he had little knowledge of, against an enemy who knew exactly what to expect. The northern beaches, stretching from the causeway in the west to the Johor River in the east, became the focus of the British defensive strategy. Engineers dug trenches and laid mines wherever possible, while soldiers erected barbed wire barricades. Tanks were positioned on key roads, artillery placed in fortified bunkers, and infantry units assigned to patrol the mangroves and dense vegetation that lined the shore. It was a desperate patchwork of strategy, bravery, and improvisation attempting to compensate for lack of preparation. Japanese forces, however, had already learned the lessons of Malaya. Under the command of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, they had studied maps, interrogated locals, and conducted reconnaissance to understand every bend of the coastline, every swamp, and every jungle patch. Yamashita's strategy was bold yet meticulous: avoid the strongest points, cross rivers at unexpected places, and use speed to prevent the defenders from regrouping. Unlike their previous opponents, the British now faced a foe who would not simply meet them head-on. They would outmaneuver, encircle, and crush them. The first Japanese landings occurred on the eastern coast of Singapore on 7 February 1942. Under the cover of darkness, infantry units waded through mangrove swamps, boats carrying soldiers slipped silently along rivers, and artillery units fired from the mainland, softening British positions. The defenders were shocked. Many had believed the thick mangroves and water channels would be a natural barrier. They were wrong. The Japanese crossed effortlessly, appearing like ghosts in the foggy pre-dawn light. Once ashore, Japanese soldiers unleashed a relentless assault. Using light artillery and machine guns, they pinned British positions while engineers cleared barbed wire and obstacles. Communication among British units began to break down immediately, messages failed to reach front-line positions in time, and reinforcements were delayed. Confusion spread among the ranks, which the Japanese exploited without mercy. The assault was not just physical, it was psychological. Soldiers who had survived the Malayan retreat suddenly found themselves surrounded, under constant fire, and witnessing positions collapse around them. By 10 February, Japanese forces had secured multiple beachheads, extending from the northeast towards the western coast. The speed of the advance shocked even the most seasoned officers. British artillery responded, firing volleys at advancing troops, but Japanese soldiers advanced under covering fire and rapidly adapted to counterattacks. The British had hoped to fight a defensive war, but the Japanese dictated the tempo, attacking where least expected and withdrawing when confronted with heavy fire, only to strike elsewhere. Inside Singapore City, civilians faced a nightmare. Air raid sirens blared multiple times a day and night. Factories, docks, and even residential areas were targeted to break morale. Families huddled in shelters, praying for news that rarely came. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Food and water became scarce as panic spread, and rumors of impending Japanese attacks caused chaos on the streets. Yet amidst this fear, ordinary citizens displayed remarkable resilience. Neighbors shared supplies, volunteers organized shelters, and children adapted quickly to life underground. On the military side, Percival faced a grim choice: concentrate his forces in one sector to defend the city's core, or spread them thin across multiple points to slow the Japanese advance. He chose the latter, hoping to hold the island's perimeter while planning a counterattack. Unfortunately, this strategy exposed gaps along the coastline. Japanese reconnaissance detected these weaknesses almost immediately. Engineers and infantry moved with precision, exploiting holes in the British defences, cutting off forward units, and establishing strongholds just behind the front lines. For the first time, it became clear that Singapore could be surrounded, isolated, and eventually starved into submission. Night raids became a hallmark of the siege. Japanese troops, familiar with Malaya's forests and rivers, navigated the terrain under cover of darkness, silently infiltrating forward positions and capturing British posts. Mortar and artillery fire disrupted supply lines and communication. British soldiers, exhausted from months of retreat and constant vigilance, struggled to maintain order. Fear, fatigue, and frustration threatened to paralyze the defense. Yet, the Japanese advance continued methodically, never reckless, never panicked, a stark contrast to the defenders' growing chaos. As the siege dragged on, the psychological strain intensified. Soldiers who survived repeated ambushes reported that Japanese troops seemed everywhere at once. Civilians shared stories of sudden strafing by aircraft and the deafening roar of artillery shells hitting infrastructure. The British command attempted to coordinate counterattacks, but every effort was met with careful Japanese resistance and superior maneuvering. It became evident, this was no ordinary battle. Yamashita was not just fighting to capture Singapore, he was demonstrating mastery of modern warfare, combining speed, deception, and discipline to break a fortress without even touching its strongest fortifications directly. By mid-February, Singapore's situation was dire. Water reservoirs were damaged, supply depots destroyed, and food distribution networks disrupted. Every day, the city's defenses weakened, not from a single catastrophic event, but from continuous pressure and attrition. Troops were exhausted, many had not slept properly in weeks. Yet, despite everything, General Percival continued to believe he could hold out long enough for reinforcements that would never arrive. Civilians watched helplessly as their city became a battlefield. Streets that had once been bustling with commerce were now silent, punctuated by explosions and gunfire. Families huddled in darkened basements, praying that their homes would survive the bombardments. Reports of atrocities, both real and exaggerated, spread fear, but also steeled determination to endure. Life in Singapore became a test of patience, courage, and sheer willpower. The Japanese siege had achieved more than just territorial gain, it had shattered the myth of invincibility. Singapore, once considered impregnable, was now a city under constant threat. Every day, the Japanese closed the news, moving closer to the moment when the fortress would be forced to surrender. And yet, the defenders still clung to hope. Soldiers reinforced trenches, civilians dug deeper shelters, and officers issued orders for last-minute counterattacks. The island had not yet fallen, but time was slipping away. By February 14, it was clear, the final battle for Singapore was imminent. By mid-February 1942, the inevitable had become painfully obvious. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, was no longer a fortress, it was a city under siege, suffocating from continuous bombardment and relentless Japanese pressure. The northern beaches were overrun, artillery positions silenced, and the defenders' morale had reached a breaking point. Civilians endured constant air raids and artillery fire, while soldiers, exhausted and outnumbered, struggled to maintain a semblance of order. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. General Arthur Percival faced an impossible dilemma. His forces numbered approximately 85,000 men, but many units were already fragmented or isolated. Ammunition and supplies were running dangerously low, and no reinforcements would arrive. The British Empire's attention was focused elsewhere, on Europe and the Middle East. Percival was acutely aware that continued resistance might cost tens of thousands of lives with little hope of success. Yet, surrender was a bitter pill, almost unimaginable for an army that prided itself on honor and duty. The question was not whether Singapore could fall, but how many more lives it would cost if it did not surrender immediately. On 8 February 1942, Japanese forces launched a coordinated attack on the western sector of the island. Infantry units moved through the dense jungle, artillery rumbled in the background, and tanks pushed through broken defensive lines. The British, stretched thin and demoralized, offered valiant resistance, but the Japanese tactics were flawless. Using a combination of surprise maneuvers and concentrated firepower, they quickly overwhelmed defensive positions. By nightfall, the Japanese had captured key high ground, threatening the city's internal communication and supply routes. It was a devastating blow. The western defense line, considered strong and well prepared, had been breached. Within the city, civilians endured terror unlike anything they had known. Bombing raids destroyed homes, schools, and hospitals. Families sought shelter wherever they could: basements, drainage tunnels, even makeshift shelters in public parks. Many civilians had already lost family members during the retreat from Malaya or in the earlier air raids. Panic spread as reports circulated of Japanese troops advancing through the northern coastline, leaving residents with the stark realization that the enemy was now only kilometers away. The psychological impact on the defenders was equally severe. Soldiers, exhausted from weeks of continuous combat, were facing an enemy who seemed unstoppable. Every attempt at counterattack failed, every supply line was compromised, and communication with higher command was unreliable. Letters from home went undelivered, and reinforcements remained a distant hope. Fatigue, fear, and desperation created cracks in the once organized defense, leaving units vulnerable to encirclement and infiltration. Japanese forces capitalized on these weaknesses. They launched night raids, infiltrated trenches, and captured strategic points behind the front lines. Mortars and artillery disrupted supply chains and communications. British officers struggled to maintain control, issuing orders that often failed to reach front-line units. In some areas, soldiers were unaware that neighboring units had already retreated or surrendered, resulting in confusion and isolated pockets of resistance. On 9 February 1942, the situation reached a critical point. Japanese artillery targeted the city's water reservoirs and power stations, crippling essential infrastructure. Food and medical supplies dwindled rapidly. The civilian population faced starvation, disease, and the constant threat of bombing. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians alike. British commanders realized that even if they could hold the northern beaches, the city itself could not survive prolonged siege. The choice became clear: continued resistance would only multiply suffering, without altering the inevitable outcome. Late that evening, General Percival made the historic decision to surrender. He summoned his senior officers and issued orders to cease all hostilities. The announcement was broadcast across Singapore: the city would fall, effective immediately. For the soldiers, civilians, and administrators who had believed in the fortress myth, the surrender was both a relief and a humiliation. They had fought bravely, but against an enemy who had combined speed, strategy, and discipline in ways they had never anticipated. Japanese forces accepted the surrender the following morning. Thousands of Allied troops laid down their weapons, some weeping, others stoically awaiting capture. Civilians watched as soldiers were disarmed and marched into captivity. The occupation had begun, and with it, a new chapter of hardship and fear. Japanese soldiers quickly moved to secure key installations, harbors, communication centers, government buildings, and began enforcing strict martial law. The transition from a bustling colonial city to an occupied territory was swift and ruthless. The consequences of the fall were profound. Approximately 80,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war, many of whom would endure harsh treatment, forced labor, and malnutrition in Japanese camps over the coming years. Civilians faced curfews, rationing, and intimidation, while the colonial administration was replaced with Japanese control. Singapore, once the pride of the British Empire, became a symbol of imperial vulnerability and miscalculation. The strategic implications were immediate: Japan gained control of a key naval base, access to essential resources in Southeast Asia, and a psychological victory that shook Allied morale across the Pacific. For the British Empire, the surrender of Singapore was a catastrophic blow. Newspapers around the world struggled to describe the scale of the defeat. Military analysts criticized Percival's decisions, particularly his underestimation of the Japanese threat and his failure to adequately prepare for land-based assaults. Politicians in London were forced to confront the reality that the empire's global power could no longer be taken for granted. The fall of Singapore, in essence, shattered the illusion of invincibility that had been carefully cultivated for decades. Yet amidst the despair, stories of courage and resilience emerged. Allied soldiers, despite being captured, maintained discipline and supported each other in POW camps. Civilians found ways to survive, often helping one another through shared resources, clandestine communication, and acts of quiet defiance. These human stories became the enduring legacy of Singapore's darkest hours, a testament to courage under circumstances where hope seemed almost impossible. The fall of Singapore also transformed the geopolitical landscape in Asia. Japan's control of the island allowed them to consolidate positions in Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond, threatening British and Allied territories throughout Southeast Asia. For local populations, the occupation brought a complex mix of fear, adaptation, and resistance. Singapore, once a symbol of colonial dominance, became a stage on which the realities of global conflict played out in stark and human terms. By the end of February 1942, the island was fully under Japanese control. The fall was complete, not with a single decisive battle, but through a combination of strategy, speed, and relentless pressure. It was a lesson in modern warfare: fortresses could be breached, myths of invincibility could be shattered, and human endurance could be tested beyond imagination. Singapore's surrender was not merely a military defeat, it was a dramatic turning point in World War II, a moment that echoed far beyond the city's shores. The story of the Battle of Singapore stands as a reminder of the consequences of underestimating an opponent, of misplaced confidence, and of the human cost of warfare. It also highlights resilience, the quiet courage of soldiers and civilians alike who endured fear, deprivation, and uncertainty with remarkable fortitude. Singapore fell, but its story of survival, adaptation, and memory would endure long after the guns fell silent.